It was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning, the kind where everything moves in sleepy repetition. The bus rumbled along its usual route, passengers half awake, scrolling through phones or staring blankly out of fogged-up windows. The driver, a quiet man in his early 50s, had done this for over 20 years. He knew every turn, every pothole, every regular passenger. Nothing ever changed. That was the comfort of the job. Until that day. Just past stop number 6, something odd happened. A child's laugh, soft, almost melodic, echoed from the back of the bus. That wouldn't have been unusual if there had been a child on the bus. But he knew every seat, and that morning, not a single child had boarded. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, heart thudding once, but saw nothing out of place. Just rows of empty seats and tired faces. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe a sound from outside. Maybe his mind playing tricks. But then, just as he turned the corner onto Dawson Street, he heard it. A whisper. So faint, so delicate, it could have been mistaken for a breeze, if it hadn't carried words. Chilling words. Words no one on the bus could have possibly said. Don't let him off the bus. Please. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his pulse spiking. It wasn't the voice of a man. It wasn't the voice of any adult at all. It sounded like a child, a frightened one. He tapped the brakes and slowed the vehicle, scanning the rows again through the mirror. No one seemed to notice. Passengers were still immersed in their worlds, unaware of the invisible frost that had just settled into his bones. But his gut told him something was wrong, deeply wrong. That whisper hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from someone, or something. And in that moment, with the engine idling, a cold certainty took hold of him. He had to find out where that voice had come from. Because something on this bus was not supposed to be there, and someone might be in danger. The bus sat idle for a few long seconds at the curb, the soft hum of the engine, the only sound cutting through the tension now tangled inside the driver's chest. He scanned the mirror again, trying not to appear panicked. No one looked up. The woman in the second row kept her earbuds in. The elderly man near the back was dozing, head resting against the window, and yet, the driver's skin prickled with something ancient and primal. Instinct. That whisper hadn't been imagined. It was too clear, too deliberate. He reached over and tapped the intercom. "Excuse me. Folks, we're experiencing a minor delay. Please remain seated." His voice was even, but his hand trembled as he released the button. He stood, stepped into the aisle, and began walking slowly toward the back. Each step echoed, hollow and heavy. His eyes darted between seats. Normal. Ordinary. But just as he reached the rear, a gust of cold air wrapped around his ankles. He froze. All the windows were closed. The whisper came again, fainter this time, like it was underneath something. "Please don't let him off." His breath caught his throat. He turned toward the last row, where an old coat lay crumpled on the seat. Slowly, he reached out and lifted it. Nothing underneath. But then, the bus jolted slightly, like it had been nudged. He whipped around. No one had moved, except for the young man in the gray hoodie near the middle of the bus. He hadn't been there before. The driver was certain of it. The young man's hood was up, his face obscured, and he sat unnaturally still, too still. The driver narrowed his eyes. There was something about the posture, the energy around him, that didn't belong. He stepped forward, cautiously. "Sir," he called. No response. "Sir, are you okay?" The man didn't flinch, didn't blink, just sat there, like he was waiting, or hiding. Something deep in the driver's gut screamed, "Don't go any closer." And then the young man turned his head, just slightly, not enough to show his full face, but enough to speak. "You shouldn't have stopped." His voice was calm, too calm, and it didn't match the whisper at all. This was something else, something older, and the driver knew, without question now, that someone, or something, was on this bus, and it wasn't human. The driver took a step back, masking his alarm behind a professional calm. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, carefully. But the young man didn't move again, didn't acknowledge the words. The other passengers remained oblivious, immersed in their own worlds. Time itself seemed to slow inside the bus. Outside, the morning light had dimmed, as if a cloud had rolled in, except there were no clouds in the sky. Then, a little girl's voice rang out from the far back. "He's not real." The driver's heart stopped. He turned sharply to find the source. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting by herself in a seat that had been empty earlier. Her dark curls framed a pale, expressionless face. She stared not at the driver, but at the man in the hoodie. "You can't let him off," she said softly, her voice carrying like a thread of wind. The driver blinked, startled. He knew that seat had been empty. He had checked it himself. He stepped toward her, trying to make sense of it. "Hey, where's your parent, sweetheart?" But she didn't answer him. She didn't even seem to hear. Her eyes stayed fixed on the hooded figure. "If he gets off here, someone won't wake up," she said. "Someone who's supposed to." Her words were calm, matter of fact, even, but they struck him like a warning from another world. The man in the hoodie finally moved, rising slowly from his seat. His face still hidden, he turned toward the doors as if preparing to leave. The driver instinctively stepped in his path. "Stop," he said, voice firmer now. "You need to sit back down." The man tilted his head, like an animal curious about prey. "You can't stop what's already begun," he said. "But you can choose who pays the price." A chilling silence filled the bus. The little girl had vanished. Just gone. Her seat empty again. The driver looked back to the front of the bus, torn between disbelief and rising terror. He didn't know who the hooded figure was, or what he was. But he knew this much. If that man walked off the bus, something terrible would happen. The driver's mind raced, scrambling for logic in a situation that defied every rule of reality he knew. He stood between the hooded man and the exit, gripping the pole beside the front doors, as if anchoring himself to something real. "This isn't your stop," he said, his voice low but firm. The hooded figure didn't argue. He simply stood there, unmoving, the fabric of his sleeves eerily still, as if no wind or breath touched him at all. Passengers began to stir, sensing something was off. A woman near the front whispered to her husband, "What's happening?" A teenager looked up from his phone, noticing the tension. But no one said anything out loud. It was as if they felt it too, that primal, inexplicable wrongness. The hooded figure turned slightly, as though he could feel their eyes crawling across his back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone made the air heavier. The driver took a cautious step closer. "Who are you?" he asked. Still, no answer. But a low creaking sound began to rise, soft at first, like the groan of old wood. It wasn't coming from the bus. It was coming from the man. The driver realized, horrified, that it was the sound of something shifting inside him. Bones, joints, or something far worse. That's when the driver noticed it. The man's shoes weren't touching the floor. A sudden jolt rocked the bus, as if something had slammed into it from the outside. Several passengers cried out. The driver turned toward the window, but saw nothing. No cars, no people, just an empty street and a flicker in the morning light that made the shadows dance unnaturally. When he turned back, the man was standing even closer. "One more stop," he whispered. "Then it begins." Panic surged through the driver's veins, but something deeper held him in place. Not fear, but responsibility. He didn't understand what this man was. He didn't know where the little girl had gone. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. If he opened those doors, the world outside the bus would no longer be safe. He backed away from the door and returned to the driver's seat, flipping the gear into neutral. The engine purred quietly, unaware of the war being waged in the silence above it. He took the radio in hand, thumbed the button. "Dispatch, this is Route 14. I need assistance at Dawson and Westbrook. Something's wrong. There's a passenger. I need someone here. Fast." Static answered him. Then a voice. But it wasn't dispatch. Too late. The whisper slithered from the speaker, making the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He dropped the radio, eyes darting toward the rearview mirror. The man was still standing, still watching, still waiting. But now, more of the passengers were aware. A woman had fainted. A man stood shakily, pointing at the hooded figure. "He's not real," he muttered. "That man, he's not real." The driver stood again, heart pounding, trying to address the passengers. "Everyone stay calm. We're not moving until help arrives." But even as he said the words, a chill ran through him. The street outside had gone completely silent. No pedestrians. No traffic. It was as if the world outside the windows had been paused. Trapped in a loop of time the rest of them couldn't touch. Then, suddenly, every phone on the bus lit up at once. No rings. No vibrations. Just screens glowing white. The same message appeared on each one. 6 words, repeating across the screens. He cannot leave. Don't let him. Passengers gasped. Some screamed. Others clutched their phones like lifelines. One man attempted to open a window, but it wouldn't budge. None of them did. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, the little girl reappeared. This time, she was standing in the aisle, one hand gently touching the edge of a seat. Her eyes were wide, but calm. She looked straight at the driver and said, "He's not here for us. He's here for one." The driver, throat dry, asked who. She glanced toward the passengers, then whispered, "The one who shouldn't be alive." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The one who shouldn't be alive. A cold stillness fell over the bus as passengers stared at the girl, trying to comprehend her meaning. The driver's mouth went dry. His hands trembled slightly on the seatback in front of him. Was this a warning? A message? A judgment? And if someone on board wasn't meant to be alive, who was it? The girl didn't say another word. She turned and walked slowly to the back of the bus, where moments ago she hadn't even existed. No one stopped her. No one moved. It was as if her presence rewrote the very rules of reality inside that vehicle. And when she disappeared again, just as softly as she came, everyone felt it. The temperature dropped. The lights flickered. And the bus itself groaned. The hooded man hadn't moved. But now his head was raised. Not to look at the driver. Not at the door. But at a man in the 4th row, mid-30s, clean cut, wearing a tan jacket. He looked perfectly normal. Ordinary, even. But as the hooded figure stared, the man's hands began to tremble. He looked around, as if realizing eyes were now on him. "What's going on?" he stammered. "Why is everyone looking at me?" The driver stepped cautiously into the aisle again. "Sir," he said, "I need you to stay calm. We're not accusing anyone. We just need to understand what's happening." The man stood abruptly. "I didn't do anything." His voice cracked. "This is insane." But something in his posture betrayed him. He knew, or suspected, and the way the hooded figure had locked onto him with such intensity made it impossible to ignore. One of the older passengers near the back whispered, "Is he the one?" Another murmured, "He looks familiar. I've seen his face before." The man's panic deepened. "I'm just trying to get to work," he insisted. "I'm nobody." But the hooded figure took a slow step forward, and in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, he spoke for the first time with certainty. "You escaped the fire, but not the consequence." Gasps rippled through the bus. The man in the tan jacket froze, his face draining of color. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice faltering. But the moment the hooded figure uttered those words, "You escaped the fire," something shifted in the eyes of the other passengers. As if the fog of confusion had begun to clear, revealing fragments of something darker beneath the surface. The driver looked between them, trying to hold the scene together. "A fire?" he asked. "What fire?" But the man in the jacket shook his head violently. "I was in a house fire 5 years ago," he confessed suddenly, eyes darting to the others. "Everyone thought I was dead, and I'll let them think that. But I had my reasons." His voice trembled. "You don't know what I went through. What I lost." Murmurs echoed around the bus. Whispers of recognition. One woman pulled out her phone and searched his name. A photo appeared. News headline: "Local man presumed dead in tragic blaze. No survivors found." But there he was, alive, standing, breathing. Not a ghost. Not a memory. But someone who had vanished from one life and started another. The hooded figure stepped forward again. Now the air inside the bus was almost unbearable, like pressure was mounting from every direction. "You weren't meant to leave that place," he said. "You stole time. You stepped out of death's hand before it closed." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was final. The man backed toward the window, face pale, breath short. "Please," he whispered. "I was just trying to survive." But the little girl appeared once more at the rear of the bus, her voice calm as ever. "You didn't just survive. You traded your place for someone else's. And he's come to collect." The bus lights flickered again. And in that moment, everyone on board realized this wasn't about punishment. This was about balance. The man in the tan jacket collapsed into the seat beside him, his face buried in trembling hands. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," he muttered. "I didn't know someone else would take my place." But his voice broke, and there was something more beneath the panic now: guilt. Heavy and aged. like a secret buried so deep it had begun to rot him from the inside. The rest of the bus was silent, no longer questioning, just watching. The driver felt his heart thundering, his instincts torn between keeping everyone safe and accepting that something far beyond his control was unfolding. He looked toward the hooded figure. "Is there another way?" he asked, his voice raw. "He's not running anymore." Maybe that means something, but the figure only stared at the man, unmoving. Then he said, "He chose to vanish. And because of that, someone else never returned home." Suddenly, the little girl moved closer to the man. Her steps were soft, almost floating. She crouched beside him, placing her tiny hand on his arm. "You have to tell the truth," she said, her voice no longer distant or eerie, but kind. "If you tell it, maybe it doesn't have to end the same way." Her words carried a strange weight, as if truth itself had the power to shift fate, as if what had once been sealed might still be rewritten. The man looked up, tears in his eyes. "I was in that house when it caught fire. I made it out through the basement window, but I didn't go back. I ran. I knew they'd think I was gone, and I wanted to disappear. My debts, my past. I thought I was starting fresh." He looked around the bus, breath shaking. "But I didn't know someone else went in after me. My brother. He thought I was still inside." Gasps echoed through the cabin. The story now had a name, a victim, a cost, and the man's voice cracked into a whisper. "He died trying to save me, and I let the world think it was me." The hooded figure stepped closer. The floor creaked under his weight. But this time he didn't speak. He only waited, because something had changed. The man's confession had opened a door that, until now, had been locked tight by silence. Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally, not with clouds, but with a gray stillness that looked too perfect, like a pause frame in a film. The world beyond the windows no longer moved. Trees didn't sway. Leaves didn't fall. A bird frozen mid-flight hovered in the distance, unmoving. Time had stopped, because the bus, in that moment, had become more than transportation. It had become a trial. The man sat motionless, eyes red, body slack with the weight of everything he'd held back for 5 long years. "He was a better man than me," he said. "He worked 2 jobs, took care of our mother. He always said he'd protect me, even when I didn't deserve it. And in the end, he did." He buried his face again. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Then, to everyone's shock, the hooded figure lowered his head, not in condemnation, but almost in respect. He took a slow step back, and in that silence, the little girl smiled. "He heard you," she said. "He was waiting for you to say it." The man looked up, confused. "Who?" he asked, but he already knew the answer. The lights on the bus flickered once more, and then stabilized. The air felt lighter, though the stillness outside remained. The passengers began to stir, as if waking from a shared trance. Some wiped tears. Others looked toward the man with something closer to reverence than fear, because they had witnessed something sacred, truth, spoken aloud after years of silence. The driver stepped forward. "What happens now?" he asked, directing the question to the hooded figure. But the figure said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked to the back of the bus. And with every step, his form seemed to shift, lighter, brighter, until, in the last row, he vanished completely. No sound, no shadow, just gone, as if the debt had been paid, or the forgiveness finally earned. The silence that followed was unlike anything they had felt before. It wasn't empty, it was full of something heavy and sacred, like the weight that comes after a final word is spoken at a funeral, or a secret is finally released. The bus still hadn't moved, but the pressure, the icy presence that had once clung to the air, was gone, and in its place was a calm that none of them could name. The man in the tan jacket sat back slowly, his posture no longer rigid with fear. He looked different now, not physically, but spiritually, like someone who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes and come out stronger. He ran a hand over his face, then looked up toward the driver. "I didn't expect that," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to still be here." The driver nodded, not sure what to say. "Maybe, now you can actually start over." The little girl, still standing near the back, took a deep breath, as if she had just surfaced from underwater. She walked back toward the middle of the bus and sat down quietly by the window. No one asked her who she was. No one dared. But her presence had shifted too. No longer a warning, but a witness. She looked out at the still frozen world and whispered, "He'll rest now." Then, slowly, the world outside began to move again. The bird resumed its flight. The trees began to sway. The traffic, faint in the distance, came back to life. It was as if time itself had resumed, acknowledging that what had needed to happen finally had. The driver returned to his seat, still shaken but grounded. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine responded with a gentle hum. He glanced in the mirror. The man in the tan jacket was staring out the window, eyes full of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps grief. Either way, he was staying, and so was the little girl. The bus rolled forward, slowly merging back into its route, as if nothing had happened at all. But for everyone on board, everything had changed. The rest of the ride passed in silence. No one checked their phones. No one made small talk. It was the kind of quiet that demanded respect, the aftermath of something none of them had words for. A spiritual hush. When the next stop arrived, a few passengers exited slowly, nodding at the driver, at the man, at the girl. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. They had all witnessed something that had cracked open the border between this world and whatever lay just beyond it. When the man in the tan jacket finally stood to leave, he paused beside the driver. "I'm going to turn myself in," he said plainly. "Not because anyone's chasing me, but because I can't live like a shadow anymore. I owe him that." The driver met his eyes and gave a single nod. "Then make it count," he replied. "Make his story part of what comes next." The man stepped off the bus and walked into the morning light, which now broke gently through the overcast sky. A breeze lifted the collar of his coat. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. For the first time in years, he was walking forward without fear. And everyone still watching from the windows knew they hadn't just seen a man survive the supernatural. They had seen him come back to life. The driver looked for the little girl in the mirror. She was still there, staring out the window, her reflection soft in the glass. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. She turned her head slightly. "For him," she said, "but not for the next one." Before he could ask what that meant, the bell chimed. She stood, walked to the front, and just like that, stepped off the bus and into the crowd, disappearing like mist. And though the driver resumed his route, nothing felt routine anymore. He now understood. This bus didn't just carry passengers. It carried stories, secrets, people running from the past. And sometimes it carried those who were no longer running, but being given one last chance to make things right. The driver finished his route an hour behind schedule, but no one complained. When he finally pulled into the depot and shut off the engine, he sat for a long moment, alone in the stillness of the empty bus. The seat where the man had sat was still slightly indented. The place where the little girl had vanished was quiet again. And yet, the air still held a charge, like a bell that had just stopped ringing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the tiny silver keychain his daughter had given him years ago, a small guardian angel made of tin. He hadn't thought about it much until now, but somehow it felt heavier, like it had been watching too, protecting, or perhaps simply reminding him that every route carries more than just people. It carries purpose. Later that evening, as he stood in front of his locker in the depot, a colleague approached. "Heard your radio cut out for a while this morning," the man said casually. "Dispatch tried to reach you, but got nothing." The driver looked at him, unsure what to say. "Yeah," he replied slowly. "Strange morning. Just a little delay." When he got home, his wife noticed the difference in his eyes before he even spoke. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, just reminded today that sometimes we're part of something bigger than we realize." He didn't tell her everything. He wasn't sure how to. Some stories aren't meant to be repeated. Some are meant to be felt and carried quietly. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence. And just before drifting off, he thought he heard it again, a whisper, faint and fleeting, just outside the window. But it wasn't chilling this time. It didn't carry dread. It carried peace, like a message left behind by someone who had been waiting for 5 years to be heard. The next morning, he returned his bus, Route 14, same number, same path. But when he stepped inside, something was different. Hanging from the rearview mirror, where he'd never placed anything, was a small strip of paper. It wasn't taped, just resting there, perfectly balanced, like it had been meant to be found. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was delicate, childlike. 6 simple words. Thank you for letting him speak. There was no name, no date, no explanation, but he knew exactly who it was from. And for the first time in his long, quiet career, tears welled in his eyes, not from fear or exhaustion, but from something deeper, grace. The rest of the day passed without incident. The bus filled and emptied. Children boarded and waved. An older woman gave him a small bag of cookies, thanking him for his patience. Nothing supernatural, nothing strange, but everything felt heightened, clearer, as if he was tuned into a different frequency now, one where every face might carry a secret. Every stop might hold a second chance. At one point, a teenage boy in a hooded jacket got on the bus and sat silently in the back. The driver glanced up through the mirror, just for a moment, and then smiled. The boy wasn't the same, but the feeling was. The unknown, the unresolved. And instead of fear, he felt readiness. Whatever came next, he knew now, his job was never just to drive. It was to witness, to guard. And so, as the sun set behind the city skyline, casting long shadows over the cracked streets, the bus moved forward once more, not just through intersections and traffic lights, but through a world where stories waited in silence until someone finally listened. Days went by, and though nothing as extraordinary as that morning occurred again, the driver couldn't shake the shift inside him. He noticed things more. The nervous way a man clutched his backpack. The distant stare of a woman who hadn't smiled in 5 stops. The tension in a teenager's shoulders that seemed heavier than any homework could explain. He began to greet people differently, not just with politeness, but with intention, like his voice might be the first soft thing they'd heard that day. One afternoon, as he approached a red light near Oak Ridge and Delaney, he noticed a young woman standing at the stop with a stroller. She looked worn, distracted, lost in thought. When the doors opened and she climbed aboard, she didn't speak, just pushed the stroller in front of her and sat near the rear. But something in her face pulled at him, a shadow of fear tucked behind her eyes. The bus rolled forward, but that feeling didn't leave him. As they turned the next corner, he heard something faint, a whisper again. But this time it wasn't supernatural. It came from the woman, speaking low into the stroller. I don't know what to do anymore. She thought no one could hear, but he did, and his grip on the wheel tightened, not in fear, but in resolve. At the next stop, as others got off, he walked toward the back and gently crouched beside her. I'm not here to pry, he said softly, but if you ever need someone to listen, sometimes a driver's seat gives you a good view of more than just traffic. She looked up, startled, but then her shoulders dropped. You'd be surprised, she whispered, how long it's been since someone said that. She didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But she smiled for the first time as she stepped off with her child at the next stop. And for the driver, that was enough. Because the miracle wasn't always in the ghost stories. Sometimes, it was in the moments where someone chose not to stay silent, and someone else chose to listen. That evening, after his shift ended, the driver sat alone in the break room, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring out the small window toward the parked buses lined up in the dark. They looked ordinary from the outside, just metal and glass and rubber. But now he knew better. These were not just machines. They were vessels, for people, for confessions, for moments that could tip the balance between despair and hope. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket, something he'd started carrying since the incident. Page 1 held the date of the man in the tan jacket. Page 2, the message from the little girl. Page 3, he started to write about the young woman with the stroller. Not her name, he didn't know it, but what he'd felt, what he'd heard, what it meant. These weren't records. They were reminders of how thin the line was between what we see and what's really there. The next day, another passenger, a teenage boy in a worn hoodie, sat near the front. He was silent the whole ride, but just as he got off, he turned and said, "You've got kind eyes." Then he walked away before the driver could respond. But those 3 words stuck with him like a gift, like confirmation, that what had begun on a strange, impossible morning was now becoming part of him. He didn't search for signs anymore. He didn't wait for whispers. But when they came, when something unseen nudged him, when someone lingered at the door a little too long, he leaned into it, not with fear, but with presence, because he now understood that the world had layers. And some stories only rise when someone is willing to hear them. And so, as Route 14 pulled out once more, the driver's hand steady on the wheel, he knew that whatever came, grief, grace, or ghosts, he would face it the same way he faced everything now. By showing up, eyes open, heart listening, ready to drive forward into the quiet mysteries that waited at every stop. There was something different about the city after dusk. How the light bent at corners, how the shadows deepened in silence. The driver noticed this more than ever now. Every alley, every park bench, every figure waiting at a stop held the possibility of something more. Not necessarily something terrifying, but something hidden, something waiting to be known. And that evening, as the sky turned a deep, inky blue, a boy boarded the bus who seemed stitched right into that mystery. He couldn't have been older than 9. No adult with him. Just a thin jacket too big for his frame and a backpack hugged tight to his chest. He paid with exact change, coins counted one by one, and took a seat near the back without a word. The driver watched him in the mirror. His eyes weren't afraid, but they weren't at peace either. They were watching, listening. 4 or 5 stops, the boy said nothing. He didn't move, didn't fidget like most kids did. He sat still, staring straight ahead, lips pressed into a firm line. Then, just before the 6th stop, he stood and approached the front. The driver turned slightly in his seat. "You okay, kid?" The boy nodded once. Then he said, "The man who got off last week, the one everyone was afraid of, he was my uncle." The driver froze. "Your uncle?" he echoed. The boy looked out the front window. "He lived with us before the fire. After he disappeared, my dad got worse. Meaner. Angrier. He always blamed him. Said he left us behind. But he didn't know." His voice trembled. "I saw the video. The one someone filmed on your bus. I recognized his voice." The driver's throat tightened. "He told the truth, kid. He told it all." The boy nodded slowly. "Then maybe my dad can stop hating ghosts. Maybe he'll listen if I tell him someone hurt my uncle. Really hurt him." The bus hissed as the doors opened. The boy stepped down onto the sidewalk, turned, and gave the driver a small wave. "Thank you for listening. For all of us who didn't get to say goodbye." The bus pulled away, but the driver sat with those words ringing in his chest like a bell that wouldn't stop vibrating. For all of us who didn't get to say goodbye. That's what it was, wasn't it? That's what all of this had been from the start. Not about punishment. Not even justice. It was about closure. About the unfinished words that haunted the edges of someone's life, and the rare moments when fate paused long enough to let them be spoken. He wrote the boy's words down in his notebook that night, carefully, word for word. It felt like a responsibility now to keep these moments preserved, not just in memory, but in something real, something lasting. Page by page, the notebook had become a collection of lives briefly intersecting with his own. Stories that might have disappeared into the hum of routine, but didn't. A few days later, another familiar face boarded. An older man who usually rode in silence. But this time, he handed the driver a folded envelope before sitting. Inside was a letter. Short. "My wife died 10 years ago. I haven't spoken her name out loud since. But something on this bus lately has reminded me. Maybe she's still listening. Tonight, I said it again. Thank you." That night, the driver drove in silence. No radio, no distractions. Just the low hum of the engine and the quiet ache of beauty. It wasn't always about ghosts. Sometimes, the people who haunted the bus weren't spirits at all. Just the living, carrying the dead around inside them, waiting for someone to ask how they were still standing. He didn't know what stop would bring the next moment, but he knew now that this was sacred ground. This aisle, these seats, this mirror he checked more than any driver ever should. It was more than a job. It was a calling. A promise whispered on an ordinary Tuesday that he would not look away. The days blurred together, but the weight of the stories never lessened. If anything, they deepened, layer upon layer of quiet truths revealed by tired faces, unspoken grief, and the occasional whisper that seemed to float through the air just before a turn. It wasn't magic, not in the traditional sense. It was something older, something sacred. The driver had stopped trying to explain it. He simply accepted it, like you accept the gravity of a full moon or the hush before a storm. One morning, a woman boarded with a bouquet of wilted flowers cradled in her arms. She sat in the front, right behind the driver, and didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were red, but dry, like the tears had run out long before the grief. Halfway through the route, she leaned forward and said softly, "I used to ride this bus every Wednesday with my daughter. She passed away 3 months ago. Today would have been her 13th birthday." The driver's chest ached. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He just drove, letting her words live in the space between them. She stared out the window as the city rolled by. "I didn't know where else to go," she added. "I just needed to be somewhere she had been." The driver nodded once. "You're exactly where you need to be," he said quietly. As they approached her stop, she stood, pressing a hand to the seat beside her, the one her daughter had once occupied. She used to draw hearts in the window with her finger. "I always told her they'd fade too fast." Then she turned to the driver, eyes soft but steady. "But they don't, do they? They stay. In some way, they always stay." She stepped off into the gray morning, leaving the flowers behind. Later, when he reached the depot, he found the bouquet still sitting neatly on the seat. But now, in the fogged glass of the window beside it, a small heart had appeared. Perfect, delicate, drawn in fresh condensation. The driver stared at it for a long time, not afraid, just grateful. Because some goodbyes, it seemed, didn't need words. They just needed to be witnessed. The notebook grew heavier in his hands with each new entry, not from weight, but from meaning. He kept it with him now, even when off duty. Sometimes he'd sit alone on a park bench after a shift, flipping through the pages, remembering each voice, each face, each moment the veil had thinned and allowed a sliver of truth to break through. And every time, he felt humbled, not chosen, not special, just present. One late evening, near the end of his route, a man stepped aboard wearing a dark suit and carrying an old briefcase. He looked tired, not from the day, but from life itself. He sat quietly until they reached the industrial stretch near the shipyards, a stop where no one ever got off. When the doors opened, the man stood but didn't move. He turned to the driver. "I used to get off here every Thursday for 20 years. Same shift, same bench. My wife would meet me with a thermos of coffee and a warm scarf in winter." The driver waited. The man smiled faintly. "She's been gone 10 years now. But tonight, I felt like I had to ride one last time, just to remember what it felt like to go home." He stepped off into the thick night air, disappearing into the same silence he had carried with him. The driver closed the doors gently and continued on. When he passed the shipyard 15 minutes later on the return loop, he looked toward the bench. And for the briefest moment, in the glow of the street lamp, he saw two figures sitting side by side, one in a dark suit, the other wrapped in a pale scarf, holding a steaming thermos between them. He blinked. The figures were gone, but his chest ached with something that wasn't fear. It was peace. Because sometimes, what haunts us isn't what we've lost. It's the fear that what we loved will disappear when no one remembers. And that night, on Route 14, someone remembered. As spring crept in, painting the trees with early green and washing the streets in light rain, the bus rolled on, its wheels tracing paths not just across the city, but through people's memories, regrets, hopes. The driver had stopped wondering when the next moment would come. He didn't need to. They always arrived in silence, in still glances, in pauses that lasted a little too long at the door. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 boarded alone, clutching a paper folder against his chest like it held something precious. He sat in the very back, whispering softly to himself. The driver watched him through the mirror, sensing something familiar in the way the boy didn't meet anyone's eyes. At the third stop, the boy stood, approached the front, and handed the driver the folder. "It's for someone who never got to read it," he said. The driver opened it slowly, revealing a hand-drawn picture. A classroom, a teacher at the front, students in their seats. In the corner, a smaller figure, sad, isolated. Beneath the drawing were the words, "I'm sorry for not speaking up when you were still here." The driver closed the folder gently, his voice low. "Who was it for?" The boy shrugged. "A teacher. She used to sit with me after school. Said I was worth listening to. But no one else treated her like that. They made her quit. Then she passed away. But sometimes I feel like she's still waiting for someone to tell her she mattered." The driver placed a hand on the folder and said, "She knows now." The boy didn't say anything more. He just nodded, stepped off the bus, and vanished into the afternoon drizzle. The folder stayed on the dash for the rest of the route, and every time the driver glanced at it, he felt something warm settle in his chest. A message delivered. A voice finally heard. Because even the smallest passengers carry the heaviest truths. And sometimes, all they need is a ride to finally let them go. That evening, the driver sat parked at his final stop. Engine off, lights dimmed, the world around him breathing in quiet stillness. The city outside kept rushing, as it always did. But inside the bus, there was a sacred pause. He opened the notebook again, added a new page, and wrote in soft strokes, "Some ghosts don't haunt to scare us. They haunt to be remembered." He closed the notebook and leaned back, eyes heavy. His thoughts drifted through all the people he had seen, the voices he had heard, some spoken, some felt. The man who escaped fire, the girl who whispered warnings, the mother and the heart drawn in fog. None of them ever truly left. Not really. They just stopped needing to be held by him. A knock startled him. He turned to the door. A young woman stood outside, unsure, soaked in the evening rain. He opened the doors without a word. She stepped in, dripping wet, looking around the empty seats. "I'm sorry," she said. I don't know where else to go tonight." The driver gestured gently to the front row. "Then you're in the right place." She sat, wrapped her arms around herself, and stared out the fog glass. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. But he wrote one more line in the notebook before starting the engine. "When they don't know where to go, bring them forward." Then the bus rolled back into the night, not to escape the past, but to carry it gently into tomorrow. Because some routes don't end. They just keep listening. Some stories don't scream for attention. They don't arrive with flashing lights or perfect timing. They unfold quietly, in the corners of ordinary moments, in whispers that carry more weight than shouts ever could. And what began as a routine morning, a whisper from the dark, became a journey into the invisible grief, guilt, and hope carried by people who ride beside us every day. This wasn't just a story about a ghost. It was a story about what happens when someone chooses to listen instead of dismiss. Throughout this journey, we watched a man behind the wheel evolve from a driver to a witness, from someone guiding a machine to someone guiding souls, both living and lost. Each passenger was more than a name or a face. They were stories unresolved, wounds unspoken, voices that had gone quiet because the world stopped listening. But on that bus, with the hum of the engine and the silence between stops, there was space for them to be heard. What this story reminds us is that we are all, in some way, passengers, carrying things we haven't named, seeking stops that don't appear on maps. And sometimes, the people we pass without a second glance are living in the middle of their own ghost story, haunted not by spirits, but by what they never got to say, to fix, to finish. The bus didn't just take them to their destinations. It brought them to moments of reckoning. So now, ask yourself, when was the last time you really saw someone? Not just looked, but saw. When was the last time you heard something that didn't make sense and leaned in anyway? The world is full of whispers waiting to be honored, pain waiting to be witnessed, redemption waiting to be unburdened. All it takes is one person who refuses to look away. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, remember someone, or see the world with softer eyes, then share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what it made you feel. Like this video if you believe every story, no matter how quiet, deserve a listener. And subscribe so you never miss the moments that remind us. Sometimes, the most powerful journeys begin with a whisper and someone willing to hear it.